The morning was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that made the air feel sharp in the lungs. Thomas Hale stood on his porch, staring toward the line of dark trees at the edge of his pasture. The storm had howled all night, burying the valley in a heavy snow, and he hadn't slept a wink. Somewhere in that blizzard, his old sheepdog, Bristle, had vanished. He'd searched until the wind turned his beard to ice, calling into the white nothing until his voice cracked. No tracks, no bark, nothing but the screaming wind. Now, in the pale light of dawn, the snow lay smooth and untouched, except for a single, strange disturbance. From the tree line, a dark, lumbering shape was moving toward him. Big. Too big for a man. Too steady for a deer. Thomas squinted, his hand instinctively finding the top rail of the fence. As the shape drew closer, details emerged: a massive brown bear, its fur dusted with snow, moving with an unhurried purpose. And dangling gently from its jaws, Bristle. The dog's body hung limp, his fur wet and tangled with ice. But Thomas saw the faint rise and fall of his chest. The bear stopped just beyond the fence, lowering the dog onto the snow with surprising care. Steam curled from its breath in the cold air. Its dark eyes flicked to Thomas's for a heartbeat, then back to Bristle, as if to say, "Here. He's yours." Thomas's heart pounded so hard he barely felt the cold anymore. In 58 years on this land, he'd seen bears pass through his property, raid his orchard, even stand up in the creek to fish. But never this. Never anything like this. The night storm had left the valley unrecognizable. Where yesterday there had been a patchwork of pasture and frozen creek, there was now only a smooth, unbroken quilt of snow stretching all the way to the tree line. The wind had died completely, leaving an eerie silence that pressed against Thomas Hale's ears. Even the usual morning chatter of crows was absent, as if the cold had stolen their voices. Thomas's boots crunched against the porch boards as he stepped outside, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. He set it down on the railing without taking a sip. His eyes kept drifting toward the far edge of the pasture, the spot where the old wooden fence dipped slightly before the land rose into the shadow of the pines. Bristle should have been there, limping toward him with his tail wagging slow but certain, like he always did after a long night out. But there was no movement, no pawprints breaking the flawless snow. The image of the night before replayed in his mind, the wind shrieking across the open fields, snow stinging his face like shards of glass, the lantern swinging wildly in his hand as he called Bristle's name into the white void. He'd searched for hours, until his breath burned in his chest and his fingers felt wooden inside his gloves. Somewhere deep down, he'd known the truth: an old dog in a storm like that didn't stand much of a chance. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to stop looking. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and started toward the fence, the snow groaning under his weight. Each step sank almost to his knees. Halfway across the pasture, he stopped. Something moved at the edge of the trees. At first it was only a shadow against the white, but it grew larger, more defined. Thomas squinted, his pulse quickening. The gait was steady, deliberate, too heavy to be a deer, too direct to be a drifting branch or falling snow. His fingers tightened around the strap of his glove, instinct warning him even as curiosity rooted him to the spot. The figure broke fully from the trees, and his breath caught. A bear. Big as any he'd ever seen, with thick brown fur dusted in snow. The scar above its right eye was pale and hairless, catching the morning light for an instant before the shadow of the pines fell away. But it wasn't the size of the animal that froze Thomas in place, it was what the bear carried. Hanging gently from its jaws, as if it knew the weight and fragility of the life it held, was Bristle. The old sheepdog's fur was matted with ice, his legs dangling limp. For a moment, Thomas thought the worst. But then, barely, he saw the dog's chest rise and fall. The bear's pace didn't change as it crossed the open field. Snow puffed up around its legs with each step, the only sound in the silent morning. When it reached the fence, it stopped. Thomas stood just on the other side, his boots planted in the snow. His mind was a blur of instinct, disbelief, and an almost childlike wonder. The bear lowered its head, setting Bristle onto the snow with remarkable care. The dog's head lolled slightly, but his eyes flickered open, clouded but alive. For a long heartbeat, the bear's gaze met Thomas's. There was no aggression in it, no fear, only a quiet steadiness, as if it had brought him something and expected nothing in return. Then, without a sound, it stepped back from the fence. Thomas dropped to his knees in the snow, his hands moving automatically to check Bristle's sides, his ears, his paws. The dog whimpered softly but made no move to struggle. His back leg was twisted at an odd angle, and his fur was soaked through, but his heartbeat was strong beneath Thomas's fingers. When he looked up again, the bear was already turning toward the trees. Its massive form moved slowly at first, then melted into the shadows of the forest, until there was nothing but the stillness and the faint cloud of its breath lingering in the air. Thomas stayed kneeling there for a long moment, his hands on Bristle's fur, the snow numbing his knees. The cold no longer seemed to bite as sharply. He didn't have words for what had just happened, only the awareness that he would never forget the sight of that bear stepping out of the woods, carrying his old friend home. Thomas scooped Bristle up with a grunt, feeling the dog's weight sag against his chest. The old collie gave a weak whimper but didn't resist, his head resting limply against Thomas's shoulder. Snow clung to his fur, already beginning to melt through Thomas's coat, but the farmer didn't notice. His eyes flicked back to the tree line again and again as he trudged toward the house, half expecting to see that massive shape still standing there. The porch steps felt steeper than usual with the weight in his arms, but he managed, kicking the door shut behind him with a snow-caked boot. Inside, the air was warm from the wood stove, the scent of pine logs thick in the room. He laid Bristle gently on an old wool blanket in front of the fire, the dog's breathing slow but steady. "Easy, boy," Thomas murmured, peeling off his gloves and rubbing Bristle's ears. His fingers traced along the matted fur of the dog's back leg, wincing at the swollen joint. It wasn't broken clean through, thank God, but it was badly sprained, maybe worse. He fetched a basin of warm water and a clean rag, working slowly to melt the ice from Bristle's fur. The dog's tail thumped weakly once or twice as the warmth seeped in. Every so often, Thomas's mind would drift back to the moment outside, the bear's dark eyes, the way it had set the dog down so carefully, the complete absence of threat in its stance. It didn't make sense. Thomas had lived in these mountains his whole life. He knew black bears and grizzlies well enough to respect them, to keep his distance. A bear might ignore a man if it wasn't hungry or threatened, but to approach a farm, to cross a fence, and to deliver an injured animal? That wasn't instinct. That was choice. He caught himself staring out the frosted window toward the woods, half expecting the bear to appear again. The snow was unbroken now except for his own deep tracks and the wide trough the bear had made. By midday, Bristle was resting more easily, his fur cleaned and dried. Thomas wrapped the injured leg in a strip of cloth, muttering under his breath the whole time about stubborn old dogs and their habit of wandering too far. But his hands were gentle, his voice low. The radio sat silent in the corner. He hadn't turned it on since the storm started. Instead, the cabin was filled with the sound of the fire popping and Bristle's slow breathing. Outside, the snow shone so bright in the sunlight it was almost blinding. Thomas thought about telling someone, his neighbor, the postman, maybe old Maggie at the feed store. But he could already hear the laughter, the disbelief. People liked a good story, but they liked a good exaggeration even more, and this was the kind of tale that would grow wild in the retelling. Still, the image wouldn't leave his mind, the bear's heavy paws pressing into the snow, the deliberate way it had crossed the pasture, the careful grip on Bristle's fur. There had been intelligence in that gaze, and something else too, something Thomas didn't have a word for. As dusk crept in, he stepped outside again, pulling his coat tight. The air was colder now, the sky streaked with the faintest trace of pink. He walked to the fence, his boots crunching in the refrozen snow, and stood in the exact spot where the bear had stood that morning. The tracks were still there, massive and deep, each pad and claw print clear. They led back toward the woods, disappearing into the shadows under the pines. Thomas stood there a long time, hands in his pockets, until the cold finally bit through his resolve. As he turned back toward the house, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. The forest stood silent, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not in a way that made his skin crawl, but in the way a man feels when he shares a quiet understanding with another living thing. The next morning, the sun broke over the ridge in a sharp, pale light that made every frost crystal on the snow glint like glass. Thomas stepped onto the porch with his coffee, the steam curling into the still air. Bristle was resting inside, his head propped on an old cushion, the bandaged leg stretched out in front of him. The dog had eaten a little before dozing off again, an encouraging sign. Thomas took a sip and let his eyes wander across the pasture. At first, everything looked undisturbed. Then he noticed it, a faint line of indentations cutting across the otherwise perfect snow from the tree-line toward the barn. He set the mug down on the railing and walked down the porch steps, boots sinking with each step. The closer he got, the clearer the shapes became, broad, deep impressions spaced in a deliberate, heavy rhythm. Bear tracks. They weren't from yesterday. The wind had softened the edges, and a thin crust of frost had formed over them. These were new, made sometime in the night. Thomas followed them slowly, his breath clouding in the cold. The trail skirted the pasture fence and stopped near the barn. There, in the lee of the wall where the wind didn't reach, the snow was disturbed in a wide, shallow depression, as if something large had settled there for a time. He crouched, pressing a gloved hand to the impression. The size of it dwarfed his own frame. Beside the hollow were smaller marks, thin grooves in the snow that led toward the barn door. He followed those too, his brow furrowing. The grooves ended at a spot where the snow was cleared completely, exposing the frozen ground. Resting there, half buried under a dusting of fresh flakes, was a piece of wood. It wasn't from the barn, it was smooth, stripped of bark, and pale, with one end gnawed down to a blunt point. Thomas picked it up, turning it in his hands. It was the kind of stick Bristle used to bring him from the pasture after a long day. The thought made his stomach tighten. Had the bear brought it? Why? He looked back toward the tree-line, the dark wall of pines standing silent and indifferent. The hollow in the snow by the barn was too deliberate to be random. A bear had lain there, resting, maybe watching. That idea should have put Thomas on edge, but it didn't. Instead, there was a strange reassurance in it. If the bear had meant harm, it had the perfect chance last night. But it had left quietly, without disturbing anything. Back inside, Thomas leaned the stick against the wall near the fireplace. Bristle lifted his head when he saw him, eyes following the movement. "You know anything about this?" Thomas asked softly, holding the stick up. Bristle's tail thumped faintly against the blanket. Thomas chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Didn't think so." But the unease wouldn't leave him entirely. He moved through his chores that day with the feeling that something was shifting, like the storm had cracked the usual order of things, letting in something unexpected. By late afternoon, he found himself glancing toward the woods more often than usual. Not searching exactly. More like waiting. When night fell, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and something else, faint, wild, and earthy. Thomas stood on the porch for a long time, listening to the distant creak of the forest, wondering if the bear was out there in the dark. He went to bed with that thought in his mind, the stick still propped near the hearth, the hollow by the barn slowly filling with fresh snow. That night, the cold came in hard and fast, driving the temperature well below freezing before the moon even cleared the ridge. Thomas kept the fire high, its orange light casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Bristle dozed by the hearth, occasionally twitching in his sleep as if chasing something in a dream. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines. Every so often, it carried a hollow creak from the barn siding, a sound Thomas knew well enough to ignore. But then came another sound, not wood, not wind. A slow, deliberate crunch in the snow. He froze in his chair, coffee halfway to his lips. The crunch came again, closer this time, measured and heavy. He set the mug down silently and moved to the window, easing the curtain aside just enough to see the yard. Moonlight poured across the snow, silver and sharp. And there, at the edge of the pasture, was the bear. Its dark shape moved with a steady rhythm, paws pressing deep into the snow as it approached the barn. The faint scar above its right eye caught the light now and then as it turned its head, scanning the yard. It didn't look toward the cabin, not at first. Instead, it went to the exact spot where the hollow had been the night before. Thomas held his breath, watching. The bear lowered itself into the snow, curling slightly, as if settling in. Steam rose from its fur in the freezing air. For a moment, it just sat there, still and quiet. Then its head turned, directly toward the cabin. Even from that distance, Thomas felt the weight of the gaze. Not threatening. Not challenging. Just aware. He stayed at the window for several minutes, not daring to move too fast. Bristle shifted on the blanket behind him, letting out a faint whine. The bear's ears twitched at the sound, but it didn't rise or retreat. Finally, Thomas stepped away from the window and opened the door just a crack, letting the cold rush in. The bear lifted its head, watching him. The silence between them felt almost tangible. In a moment that Thomas would later replay countless times in his mind, the bear made a low, almost inaudible huff, an exhale more than a growl, and then stood. It crossed the snow slowly, turning toward the woods without haste. The moonlight traced its back as it disappeared into the tree line, the deep pawprints it left behind already beginning to fill with drifting snow. Thomas stood in the doorway long after it was gone, the cold biting into his skin. The image of that silent exchange burned into him. He couldn't explain why, but he knew the bear would be back. And when it came, it wouldn't be for Bristle. The morning broke under a pale sky streaked with thin clouds, the kind that promised more snow before nightfall. Thomas stepped out early, the crunch of his boots loud in the stillness. Bristle watched from the window, his ears pricked, tail wagging faintly. The yard was marked again with those same deep pawprints, fresh, sharp-edged, and heavy. They led from the barn toward the treeline, cutting a deliberate path. Thomas pulled his coat tighter and stepped over the fence rail, following the trail. The snow was deep enough to slow him, each step sinking nearly to his shins. Still, he pressed on, the cold air burning his lungs. The tracks were spaced evenly, no sign of panic or rush. Whatever the bear was doing, it was moving with intent. He reached the trees, where the snow grew patchy under the heavy branches. Here, the prince wound between the pines, avoiding the thickest drifts. Thomas found himself ducking under low limbs, the air suddenly smelling of sap and earth instead of open frost. After several minutes, the tracks veered into a small clearing. Thomas stopped dead. In the center of the clearing was a pile of branches, sticks, and pine boughs, arranged, not scattered. They formed a crude sort of nest, or maybe a shelter. Near the edge of the pile lay something else, a tattered strip of cloth, frozen stiff. He picked it up, brushing away snow. It was a piece of faded blue flannel, frayed at the edges. His heart gave a slow, hard beat. It looked like the same shirt he'd used as a rag years ago and tossed on the compost heap behind the barn. What was it doing here? He scanned the ground, noticing smaller marks in the snow around the pile. Claw scratches. They weren't the random scuffs of a foraging animal, they were deliberate, like something had been digging or shaping. The air in the clearing felt oddly still, muffled. He could hear the faint groan of the trees shifting under their snow load, but nothing else. No birds, no wind. A rustle made him turn sharply, but it was only a branch dropping its snow. Still, the sense of being watched prickled along his neck. He tucked the cloth into his coat pocket and stepped backward, careful not to disturb more than he had to. His boots found the bear's trail again, and he followed it back toward the farm, glancing over his shoulder more than once. When the cabin came into view, Bristle was still at the window, head tilted as if trying to read his expression. Thomas climbed the steps and went inside, shutting the door behind him. He set the flannel scrap on the table. The smell of pine clung to it faintly, mixed with something warm and musky, wild, but not unpleasant. As the fire crackled, Thomas sat there staring at it, thinking of the shelter, the arrangement of sticks, the deliberate way the bear had moved. It was as though the animal was leaving him a trail, or maybe an invitation. By late afternoon, the light had turned the snow a muted gray, the first flakes of a new storm beginning to drift lazily from the sky. Thomas had spent most of the day with the flannel scrap sitting on the table beside him, his eyes wandering to it every few minutes. Bristle, though still limping, was moving more comfortably now, occasionally padding to the door to sniff at the cold air. As twilight settled, the wind eased. The quiet felt heavier than usual, the kind that makes you notice every small sound. Thomas was setting another log on the fire when Bristle's head lifted sharply. His ears pricked forward, body tense. Thomas froze, listening. There it was, a deep crunch in the snow outside, steady and deliberate. The same sound as before, but closer this time. He crossed to the window, careful not to let the floorboards creak. Outside, the fading light painted the pasture in shades of silver and blue. The bear was there, moving toward the barn, each step slow and measured. Snow clung to its thick fur, the scar above its eye pale against the dark of its face. But this time, it wasn't empty-jawed. Clamped carefully between its teeth was something long and narrow. As it came closer, Thomas could see the shape more clearly, a stick, stripped smooth, with one end wrapped in something dark. The bear padded up to the same hollow beside the barn and lowered itself into it. Then, with surprising gentleness, it set the stick down on the snow in front of it. Thomas's brow furrowed. The wrapping on the stick wasn't bark. It looked like leather. Curiosity overrode caution. He pulled on his coat and stepped out onto the porch, boots sinking into the soft snow. The bear's head lifted immediately, eyes locking on him. For a long moment, they just looked at each other across the yard. Then, slowly, the bear nosed the stick forward, pushing it across the snow toward him. Thomas's breath fogged in the air as he stepped down from the porch, crossing the yard in slow, deliberate strides. Bristle watched from the doorway, his tail low but wagging. When Thomas was close enough to reach, the bear sat back slightly, giving him space. He crouched, picking up the stick. The leather strip was worn and cracked, but the stitching was familiar. It was part of an old work glove he'd lost seasons ago while repairing the fence near the tree line. He looked back at the bear, the question unspoken but heavy in his chest. The animal's breath rose in soft plumes, its gaze steady. Then, without a sound, it turned and walked back toward the pines, leaving deep prints in the untouched snow. Thomas stood there until the bear was gone, the stick heavy in his hands. He didn't know why, but the gesture felt deliberate, like the animal was returning something, maybe even reminding him of something. Back inside, he placed the stick beside the flannel scrap on the table. Two objects, both carried here by the same massive creature, both tied to his own past in small but undeniable ways. Bristle limped over, sniffed the stick, and gave a soft huff before curling up by the fire again. Thomas sat down, the storm building outside, wondering just how deep this strange thread between man and bear might go. That night, the snow came down in thick, wind-driven sheets, rattling against the cabin windows like handfuls of gravel. The pines groaned under the weight, branches shedding clumps of snow that hit the ground with dull thuds. Inside, Thomas kept the fire roaring, its glow battling back the cold that seeped through the log walls. Bristle lay close to the hearth, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. Every now and then, his ears twitched, catching sounds buried beneath the howl of the storm. Thomas noticed it too, a faint, rhythmic crunch that didn't belong to the wind or falling snow. At first, he dismissed it as his mind playing tricks, the way storms can bend familiar sounds into strange shapes. But as the night wore on, the noise returned, steady, deliberate, pacing. He rose from his chair and moved to the window, peering through the frost. The storm blurred everything beyond a few yards, but he caught movement, a dark, solid mass just at the edge of visibility, between the barn and the tree line. It wasn't moving away. It was circling slowly, leaving deep impressions in the snow that were quickly filling with drifts. The hair on the back of his neck prickled, not from fear, but from the realization of what it meant. The bear wasn't passing through. It was staying close. He pulled on his coat and cracked the door open. The cold hit him like a wall, stealing his breath. Snow swirled in thick curtains, catching in his beard and lashes. Through the flurries, he saw it, massive, fur-dusted with ice, the faint scar over its eye glistening in the lamplight from the porch. The bear paused when it saw him, steam curling from its breath. Then it gave a slow, deep huff and resumed its pacing, circling wider now, each step sure despite the storm. Thomas realized with a start what it reminded him of, a shepherd dog patrolling the edge of a flock. He stayed there for a while, the door open just enough for Bristle to poke his head out, ears perked. The dog didn't growl. He didn't even seem uneasy. Instead, he watched intently, tail giving a single slow wag. When Thomas finally closed the door, the bear was still there, its shape ghosting in and out of the snow squalls. He sat back in his chair, listening to the storm and the faint, steady rhythm of those heavy paws outside. Somewhere in his chest, a quiet understanding settled. The bear wasn't just visiting anymore. It was watching over them. By dawn, the storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a sky so clear and sharp it made the snow glare painfully bright. The air was bitter cold, but the wind had dropped, and the world outside the cabin was so still it felt as if the storm had never happened, until Thomas stepped onto the porch. The yard was a map. Where yesterday's snow had been smooth, now there were deep, purposeful tracks etched into it, circling the cabin and barn in wide loops. Each pawprint was clean-edged in the frozen crust, evidence of movement that had gone on for hours. Thomas moved down the steps, his boots crunching into the fresh snow. He followed one of the loops toward the barn, noting how the trail hugged the fence line, doubling back in places, as if the bear had stopped to check something before moving on again. Near the barn door, the snow was disturbed in a broad, shallow patch, flattened from the weight of something massive lying there. He crouched, gloved hand pressing into the indentation. It was still faintly warm. His gaze traveled to the fence post just a few feet away. Caught in the rough wood was a tuft of fur, coarse, dark brown, tipped with frost. He plucked it free, rubbing it between his fingers. Bristle's bark from the porch made him glance back. The dog wasn't alarmed, his tail wagged slowly, head tilted, as if he recognized a scent on the wind. Thomas looked toward the tree-line. At first, nothing moved. Then, between two pines, he caught the faintest shift, a massive shape stepping back into the shadows. The bear didn't advance, didn't retreat. It just stood there, head lifted slightly, watching. He raised a hand, not sure why, a half-wave or maybe a silent acknowledgement. The bear's ears flicked once, and then it turned and melted into the forest without a sound. Back inside, Thomas set the tuft of fur beside the stick and flannel scrap on the table. 3 objects now, 3 small proofs of a connection he still couldn't quite name. As he stoked the fire, he found himself thinking less about why the bear was here and more about what it seemed to be doing. Protecting. Patrolling. Waiting. It was a thought that should have unsettled him. Instead, it made the cabin feel a little less empty. Over the next 2 days, the pattern held. Every morning, Thomas found fresh loops of pawprints in the snow, always circling, always deliberate. Bristle seemed to grow more alert, often lifting his head toward the tree-line as if listening for a signal only he could hear. But on the 3rd day, something shifted. It was mid-morning, the sun throwing long blue shadows across the drifts. Thomas was splitting wood by the barn when Bristle's bark rang out, sharp, urgent, not the casual sound he used for passing deer. Thomas dropped the maul and looked toward the cabin. Bristle stood at the porch rail, facing the forest, tail stiff, ears locked forward. And then Thomas saw it. The bear was there, not pacing this time, but standing still at the tree-line. Snow dusted its back, the scar above its eye bright in the sun. Between its front paws, half buried in the snow, was something small and pale. Thomas set down the gloves and walked slowly across the yard, keeping his movements deliberate. The bear didn't retreat. If anything, it seemed to straighten slightly, as if presenting what it had brought. When he was close enough, he saw it wasn't just a stick this time. It was a length of antler, shed naturally, smooth at the base, its tines intact. The kind of thing deer drop in the deep woods come late winter. Thomas crouched, the snow crunching under his knees. The antler was placed neatly in front of the bear, not dropped at random. He looked up, meeting its gaze. The bear's eyes were dark, unreadable, but steady. You bringing me gifts now?" Thomas said softly, his breath clouding the air. The bear exhaled through its nose, a deep, controlled huff, and nudged the antler toward him with its paw. Then it stepped back a pace, waiting. Thomas reached out and took the antler. It was heavier than he expected, cold and solid in his hands. The bear lingered a moment longer, watching him, then turned and disappeared into the trees without a sound. Back at the cabin, Thomas set the antler beside the flannel, the stick, and the tuft of fur. 4 items now. And with each one, the feeling in his chest grew, this wasn't random. The bear wasn't wandering. It was building something. A message. Bristle sniffed the antler carefully, then looked toward the forest and let out a quiet, almost questioning whine. Thomas rested a hand on the dog's head, his own gaze drifting to the dark line of pines. Whatever the bear was waiting for, he had the sense it was coming soon. The snow returned that night, soft and silent, settling in thick layers that muffled every sound. Thomas sat by the fire, the 4 objects lined up neatly on the table, the flannel scrap, the leather-wrapped stick, the tuft of fur, and the antler. Bristle lay curled at his feet, the steady rise and fall of his breathing the only movement in the room. It was just past midnight when Bristle stirred. His head lifted, ears flicking toward the door. A moment later came the sound, deep, heavy, unhurried steps in the snow. Thomas didn't rush. He pulled on his coat and boots, opened the door, and stepped into the still, cold air. The moonlight made the snow glow faintly blue, every shadow sharp. The bear stood in the yard, closer than it had ever come before. The scar above its eye caught the light, and its breath steamed in the freezing air. Between its paws was something wrapped in a bundle of pine boughs. Thomas approached slowly, each step sinking into the snow. The bear didn't move, didn't shift its weight, just waited. When he was close enough, he saw what was inside the bundle, a weathered wooden tag, its edges worn smooth by years of exposure. Faded letters were burned into one side, nearly lost under scratches and time. He lifted it carefully, brushing away the snow. The name was faint but unmistakable, Bristle. Thomas's throat tightened. This wasn't his doing. Years ago, before the limp, before the farm, Bristle had been a lost dog found in the woods by someone else. And now, in a way he couldn't explain, this bear had carried a piece of that past back to him. He looked up. The bear's eyes met his, steady and calm, and in that moment Thomas felt something pass between them, not language, not even thought, but recognition. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the stillness. The bear gave a slow blink, then turned toward the tree-line. It paused once, glancing back, before disappearing into the pines without a sound. Thomas stood there for a long while, the tag warm in his gloved hand despite the cold. Behind him, Bristle came down the steps, tail wagging slow and steady, nose lifting toward the path the bear had taken. Inside, Thomas placed the tag alongside the other objects. 5 now. A strange collection, but each one carried weight, a story only he and the bear seemed to know. The fire cracked, the snow whispered against the windows, and in the quiet Thomas realized something that would stay with him the rest of his life. Sometimes, the truest bonds don't need words at all.